Alright, looks like we're good to go. So tonight's lecture is going to be over the Ponziani opening. I know we've covered a couple lines on our YouTube before with Harris and Kaiser, so I just want to shout that out. But tonight we're going to be looking at more of the main lines, no weird tricky gambits other than the gambit that gave this opening its name. Alright, let's get into it. First move, pawn e4 and pawn e5. After pawn e5, we get knight to f3, which is just developing our piece and adding pressure to the center, and black must respond. Black's most common move here is knight to c6, defending the pawn with a piece, so you're developing as well. And now we get this move, pawn to c3, which indicates the Ponziani opening. Now this opening has been recorded as early as 1497, and early in its career this opening was known as Staunton's opening, after Howard Staunton. So here after c3, what are the main ideas? Well, I think I'll actually ask the chat, what do you guys think are the main ideas here? I see a couple questions coming in that we can answer while I wait for you guys' responses. Okay, we have a question. Is this opening good for kids or beginners? I don't really think I can recommend it for the brand new chess players. Some of the ideas here are a bit more strategic rather than just completely tactical, which kids seem to excel at. You probably want to have a little bit of chess experience under your belt here. So yeah, with that being said, Rostberry, I don't think it would be a good first opening. Okay, we have some of the ideas coming through here. Dot Spider is saying the idea is pawn to d4. Sandro Schock is saying pawn to b4 with a delayed Evans gambit. And then David Sevilla is saying the other knight comes out. So I'm assuming knight a3. And we're getting a bunch of responses for king e7, which is probably the best move on the board. Obviously not. But yeah, Dot Spider in the chat here is getting it correct. The idea is going for a d4 push, expanding in the center. I know we had this idea of b4, calling it a delayed Evans gambit, but the problem is if you play b4, it's defended by the pawn, and it's not a gambit. So d4 is the main idea here. This move can be considered a little premature because it blocks the natural square for the knight. This knight does want to go to c3, but we now block it with this pawn. So it might be considered not good because of that. So you're also creating a bit of a hole on d3. Black can't take advantage of this now, but let's just say they got like 2 free moves and it would be protected. This knight to d3 could be annoying, but that's in the future. There is a plus side to this, though, in that you are creating a second diagonal for your queen, and in some of the lines we're going to look at tonight, we're going to be looking at early queen a4 moves. People are suggesting bishop to b5. This may be an idea we see later, and we also get a mention in the chat of the Ruy Lopez. So some of the ideas here may be very similar to a Ruy Lopez or a Gioco Pianissimo, where you get d3 and you get this very slow push for d4. But I think in our main lines, it's going to be a little bit more active with our pieces than the Ruy and Italian. Okay, so I have a couple people in the chat. Benjamin Fabian looks like one suggesting moves for black. And we're getting suggestions for bishop to c5 and knight to f6, which are both very logical moves. And we're going to be looking at knight to f6. I want to cover bishop c5 though, because I don't have that one in my notes. But after bishop to c5, I think white is just going to be much better after continuing with their plan of d4. And okay, if black ends up taking, you take back with your pawn, the bishop has to retreat. Or I guess it can come to b4 with check. But none of these moves cause white any problem. You now clear up the square for your knight to go on c3. And I don't see what black has gained out of this. So bishop c5, while it looks natural, does invite this straightforward move, pawn to d4. All right, we should cover knight to e7. So knight g to e7 is known as the K-Mach variation. And here I'm just going to suggest bishop to b5, and this transposes to a Ruy Lopez Cosio defense, where the main move order for that is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and after the knight moves, you play c3. So that's going to be my recommendation, just transpose to the Ruy Lopez. I'm not going to be covering that opening because it is a separate system, but I did want to mention knight g to e7. There is transposition there. Now what if black tries this move d6? So d6 looks pretty good. You're defending the e-pawn, but there's a couple problems with this. One, you're blocking in your dark square bishop. So like I said, bishop to c5 does look attractive. And when you play d6, you block your bishop in. Now, this is also trying to show that c3 is a little unnecessary for white to play, because after d6, it looks like they're just strengthening the center, but it's a little passive. White can just continue pawn to d4, captures, and again, we see with this trade on d4, it opens up c3 for our knight and shouldn't cause any problems. We just develop normally. H3 is stopping bishop to g4, which pins the knight to the queen and loosens your grip on d4. But both sides just develop rather naturally, and in this position, white is, computers are giving it almost +2, but I'm just going to say white is much better here, as the knights are developed to natural squares. You're ready to push either pawn when necessary. You just have a very flexible position with more space. Only white can be better here. Okay. So, pawn to d6 doesn't look too great here. But we're going to get into our three main moves here. And I'm going to cover, I guess, f5 first. F5 is one move. And then the other moves are knight to f6 and pawn to d5. But we're going to cover f5 here, which looks a little strange at first, but this is actually the move that gave the Ponziani its more modern name, with the Ponziani counter-gambit. So here with f5, what is the point? Well, if white just takes, the very first idea you might have is play pawn to e4. And the idea of this is that you are trying to expand, because white has conceded this control in the center, but this is not going to be the best plan for black. Even knight d4 here, this trade doesn't do much for white. Instead, white doesn't actually go for this knight right away. They go queen h5 first, and now with something like g6, you're already going to be winning after f takes g6, and you're threatening g7, check by the queen, and picking up the rook. So taking this knight is a little bit of a trap. Knight f6 is going to be better. But white here also doesn't have many problems. Black's pawn was a little overextended. So if white takes, there are a couple other moves here. And white can also decline this with pawn to d4. But I do want to mention after pawn takes, queen to f6 is going to be a very good move. I also want to mention expanding in the center with d5 isn't going to be great, because after bishop to b5, black continues developing their pieces rather naturally while adding pressure to e5, and this isn't going to be fun. Just for an example, you have to reinforce e5. White just continues with d4 like they've been wanting to all along, and I guess that black has to go e4. And something like bishop g5 is playable immediately. While your knight is attacked, you do attack their queen first. White is going to be fine after d5. So you have to go queen f6 if you're looking for maximum play. Pawn to d4, and now after pawn to e4, you bring the knight to d2, just put pressure on the pawn. This is going to be fine. And after queen takes f5, you can just go bishop e2, and I don't see how black is posing any problems. I think white is just safe here. But okay, what happens if white doesn't take this, this pawn here? Well, the other alternative is going pawn to d4. Again, white just has this main theme they're going around, trying to get that d4 push in and get a lot of space. Now here, Normally black will take on e4 with the pawn, and white captures on e5, so material is equal. And now we get either queen to f6 or knight to f6. We'll take a look at knight f6 first, just putting a little bit of control on e4, maybe the d5 square. Now bishop to g5, developing the bishop to a natural square, creating a pin. Pawn to d6, kicking the knight. Trade of knights, and knight to d2, putting pressure on e4 again. This position is going to be rather equal. Black can play something like pawn to d5, or they can try and attack somewhere else with rook to b8, putting pressure on the b pawn. So all these moves are fine. Bishop e7 is going to be fine here. Black may be down a pawn, but open lines for the bishop's not going to be struggling too much in development. Should make for an interesting game. Like I said, if you're not going to play knight f6, there's also queen to f6. And here it gets a little interesting. Knight to g4 looks like a strange move at first. You are attacking the queen, but how often do you get a knight on g4 on move 6? You just got to be careful you don't hang the knight anytime in the future after black plays something like d5. But currently, it is fine. The queen is protecting the knight. We get the queen to g6, saving the queen from an attack. Bishop to f4 developing. We're developing our queenside pieces. This knight does want to go to d2. So it makes a lot of sense that we're developing this bishop right now before the knight. Otherwise, if we develop the knight, the bishop is going to be stuck on c1, and we're going to have problems developing it later. After bishop to f4, we do see d5, and we see this attack on the knight. You can play bishop e2 here, and from what I've seen, this leads to rather unclear positions. Queen f7 is one move that can be played right away, attacking the bishop. But I think the recommendation I'm going to go for is knight to e3. And this may seem strange to a lot of beginner players. You know, you're moving this same piece multiple times. You moved it to f3, to e5, to g4. Now you're moving it to e3, and it's only move 8. Half your moves have been knight moves. But I think retaining the knight, keeping it on the board in a central position, adding pressure to d5 should be fine. And here there's only one move for black. If black does not play this move, white already has a very strong advantage, +1.5 by Stockfish 13. But the move they need to play is queen to f7. This is to reinforce the d5 square, and this is also to add a little bit of counterattack on this bishop. And now the bishop can drop back to g3, and now after h5, h4, I ended my analysis of this line, leaving it rather an unclear position as well, pretty balanced for both sides. Black does have a lot of space, white does have a little bit of development here that they can say is good for them. Again, I would say it would make for an interesting game, but theory doesn't need to go too deep, as most players do not play f5. Most players will now play knight to f6 or pawn to d5. So before we move on to those moves, I just want to make sure we don't have any questions about f5 and the Ponziani counter gambit. Let's see. Looks like we don't have any questions coming through, so we are going to move on here. I'm going to start covering d5, I think. Look at d5 first. This is the most popular move, and this is known as the Jaenisch counter-attack. And this is black expanding before white can, putting pressure on the pawn. Normally playing d5 really early as black is not going to be too great because of pawn captures, queen captures, and knight c3. But as you'll notice in this position, that's not possible because the pawn is on c3. So playing d5 here can be considered for black, and like I said, it is the most popular move. After pawn to d5, what move should white play? This is the question white must answer with his following move, and it's not too clear at first. If you just take the pawn, black is going to be happy. They develop the queen, get it off the back rank, bishop g4 is going to come, and then they can castle queenside, and there's no problems for black. If you're not going to take, I guess, what if you play d3? If you play d3, black can capture, you recapture, and you lose your right to castle, which isn't the best, not going to lie. And then this pawn on e4 may be a little tough to defend. I guess if you go knight to d2 and f3, you have no problems, but then what is your knight doing on d2? So you don't want to give up your right to castle. Don't want to have to start worrying about e4. We're getting a couple suggestions in the chat. We'll start with d4, which looks like it's possible, but black does gain a bit of an edge after pawn takes on e4, knight takes on e5, and again, for the same reasons as d3, you don't want to lose your right to castle because it will delay your development of the rook. So d4 also doesn't quite work. We have the suggestion of bishop to b5, but this is actually a mistake. Black can get an edge here where they are better. After d takes e4, because you're hanging this pawn, they might as well take it. And now knight takes e5, you take it back, and they cannot recapture because the knight is pinned by the bishop. So we get queen g5 from black, a very active move, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn, and if you just move the knight back to c4 to safety, well, now you're hanging this bishop on b5, so white does need to be very careful. Queen to a4 here, letting the knight hang, and the reason for this is that if they take, well, now white can take on c6, and what was giving up this knight is now resulting in white getting a rook. So this is actually going to be just fine for white, but that's only if black takes on e5. Instead, black should take on g2. And after queen takes g2, you have to save your rook, so rook f1. And this is not looking too great already. Your pawn on h2 is hanging. Your knight's hanging out on e5, adding pressure. You have a lot of pressure on c6. But it's not going to be doing you too much. You're also way behind in development on the queen side. Let's see how black can continue to keep their edge. Bishop to d6, just attacking the knight. And now you can either take on c6 with the knight or the bishop. But I think if you take on c6 with the knight, you run into this move a6, which looks very strange for black to play because it looks like they have a discovery. But the real question is, where are you going to put this knight? There's no great square. If you try knight to a5, they just take on b5 with the pawn, and you can take on b5 with your queen, but now after bishop to d7, you don't have a square where you can save the knight and the queen. If you try queen to h5 protecting both, you run into knight f6, and this covers the last square along this rank, which protects the knight. So, unfortunately, there is no good discovery with the knight, so you have to do something else. You might as well try d4 and try and develop your queen side here. But again, after knight f6, black is way ahead in development. They do have counter chances with this attack on the bishop and a lot of pressure with the queen in your position. People are saying knight to a7. Yeah, what if you try knight to a7? Well, you take on b5 again, and if you take with the queen, you lose you don't lose the knight right away. Bishop d7 first. And I guess if you take on b7, you can claim white is doing fine, but after rook to d8, white has nothing. If you have a follow-up here, I'd love to hear it, but here black is just up too much in development. Looks like they're up in material. Not too great. We're getting knight to d4. If knight to d4, again, take on b5 because you're down a piece from white taking on c6. And okay, your only real try is taking on a8. But after knight to e7, the pieces that black has are just going to come flooding into your position. What do you try here? How are you going to develop your queenside pieces? This is turning into Risko Plays chat. What do you play in this position? All of white's pieces are just tied up. None of them are coordinating. Maybe you try d3? Oh, someone in chat said resign. Okay, we don't need to analyze this anymore. Yeah, after a6, black is just better. So if you take on c6 with the bishop, story is a little different. Pawn takes, and now you take on c6 with the queen. But black is actually doing surprisingly well after king e7. And, okay, if you take on a8 with the queen, bishop h3 is going to win the game. They're threatening mate, and knight f6 is going to be coming. There's no way to save your rook here. So, after king e7, you can't take the rook because of this bishop h3 threat. So, pawn d4, creating a flight square for your king, trying to open up something like bishop g5, but it's not working because of the queen. And bishop h3 anyway. Here, you have like queen c4 if you want, but you're going to be losing an exchange here. So this is why bishop to b5 is not a great move. So we go back to move 4. What does white actually play if none of these moves are working? Well, we had it in the chat. Queen to a4. We have a quick question in the chat. Has the Ponziani been played at the GM level? For sure. This has been played at all levels. You don't see it too much anymore at the Grandmaster level because some players might think it's just too passive for white for all the reasons we said before. You kind of block the natural square of the knight. But this is for sure playable. And you might see it more in blitz and rapid games. Probably not as much in classical. If you are looking for masters who do play this opening, Eric Rosen has a lot of good content on his channel with the Ponziani where you can see him using some beginner tricks. But okay, yeah, queen a4 here. And this is threatening the e-pawn actually because you are still pinning the knight. And the difference between this and bishop b5 is that they can't just take. If they do take, well, knight takes e5, you still have this, and there is no a6. A6 does not exist because it's not coming with tempo anymore. So that's one of the main differences. So how does black protect this pawn on e5? There's a few different moves here. We'll start taking a look at them. Like I said, d takes e4 is not the best here. Just because knight takes, and queen d5 is fine. If you're not playing d takes e4, another try is queen d6, and this one I was actually a bit of a fan of, because after queen d6, you're protecting your pieces without compromising your pawn structure. We get white playing d4, expanding in the center, bishop d7 breaking this pin, and now queen b3, because you don't want to run into knight d4. So after queen b3, d takes e4, knight takes e5, takes, and now queen b7, and you get that pawn back from before. And now rook d8. And so far, pretty equal position. You have knight d2 or bishop to e3 as continuations for white. And computer says white has a small advantage in these lines, but I think practically it's anybody's game. Black does have the development, I think, in compensation for giving up the queenside pawn. So that's an idea for black that I was a fan of, is queen d6. But okay, let's say you're not a fan of giving up your queenside pawns like that. What else can you play? Well, you could try bishop to d7, and this is the Caro variation. And this is probably black's best scoring system, according to the databases I was looking at, the Lee Chess Masters, the Lee Chess Players, and Mega Database. I guess there's a couple people in the chat asking what if white takes on a7 in the previous line. I might as well answer that. Oh. Come on, Leechess, work with me here. Queen d6, and we go through this line. There. Okay, what if white just takes? Well, your queen's out of the game here. Now bishop c5. First, the queen's attacked, so let's save the queen. And then black finishes their development. So at the cost of the queenside pawns, black is fully developed and castle short is coming. Meanwhile, your queenside isn't developed at all and your king is stuck in the center. Why don't you take on d6? Or sorry, d5? You can take, and after queen takes, you're fine. You can still play d4. But I don't see the need to trade off the pawns. Like there's no pressing reason why you need to do it right away, but you can if you want. Okay, queen a4. Back to the Caro variation. Bishop d7. Like I said, maybe black's best scoring system, and I think it's because white has a few moves that are pretty much only moves. I'm pretty sure that's this variation here. You take on d5, and after knight to d4, your queen is being attacked, so you can't just take the knight. You have to go queen to d1. You're undeveloping the queen. And now knight takes f3, queen takes f3, and knight to f6. You can play bishop c4, protecting your pawn again, developing, getting ready to castle. Now pawn to e4 from black. It is supported by the knight, so you can't just take. You just go queen e2, bishop to d6, and if you play d4, this can lead into some unexplored territory after castles and h3 and rook e8. Knight a3 is possible continuation. Or you can play pawn to d3, putting pressure on the pawn right away, where after castles you can take, knight takes, and bishop to e3, closing up the file so you don't run into any rook e8 traps. Rook e8 anyway to develop onto an open file. Knight d2, trades. You can take with the king, which is actually better than taking with the queen, which is a little odd. If you take with the queen, this runs into queen h4, and now you might have some problems with the rook trying to come in. Like, rook can take on e3 right away, and if the queen takes, then rook to e8, and you're losing a queen. So after queen takes d2, you run into some very, very serious problems after queen h4. I should also mention this bishop on c4 is hanging, so there's no way to stop both of these threats. Just go king to d2, and you maintain a sense of equality. So a lot of traps white can fall for in the Caro. Let's go back here. The other two options you have are knight to f6 and pawn to f6. So we'll cover knight to f6, and this is the Leonhardt variation, where after takes on e5, again trying to make use of this pin, you get bishop to d6 attacking the knight, takes, and then rather than take on c6, because this runs into bishop d7 and your queen has to go to a6 and your queen's kind of out of the game, and knight takes, black just has all the space in the world here. Rather than take and allow that, you play pawn to d3 supporting your pawn. If they do take, you're fine to take back with your pawn. Let's see, but black will normally play castles, followed by bishop e2 and rook e8. And here, theory is saying that if white ever takes this pawn, black's just going to be better. And this is mainly because of the move bishop to d7. So don't get too tempted, don't take this pawn. Just continue with normal development. Something like bishop g5 is completely fine here. Okay, let's go back. That's the kind of the gist of the Leonhardt variation. But now we're going to get into f6. This might freak some of you guys out. Longtime viewers who remember Ben Feingold's lectures are probably screaming right now. But f6 is the main move here. This is known as the Steinitz variation and may be the best move for black. Now, the argument against this is that you're blocking the development of the knight. What do? Well, you just have to deal with it right now. White is going to pile up pressure on c6, and now you get knight to e7, protecting the knight with the other knight. That way, if bishop captures, you can maintain your pawn structure. Takes on d5, queen takes d5. You can't really take with the knight because this defeats the purpose of knight e7. So queen takes, and again, you don't have knight c3 here. That's why this is okay for black. Instead, white continues with d4. If you try to castle right away, bishop d7 is going to give up a lot of the pressure white has on the position, and black may actually be coming out ahead here. So you go d4, create a bit of tension in the center, bishop to d7 to relieve the pressure on the a4 to e8 diagonal, and now bishop to e3. Here, white has not had the most favorable score, and it's actually, I believe, this specific line, which is why most players don't play the Ponziani anymore, is because black's pawn structure is very solid. All of the pieces are developed. Black is getting ready to castle, not queenside, I don't think, because there's pressure here, but this knight developing to f5 is possible. But yeah, here there's just a lot of good moves. So I think even just rook d8 right here. But I like knight f5, just keeping up pressure. So because of this variation, white can face a lot of trouble. And that covers, I think, most of the d5 moves. I guess the best responses from white, just know after d5 you go queen a4 and pin the knight. We'll get into the last alternative here, knight f6, but I do want to take another moment, make sure we don't have any questions after pawn to d5. Give it another 10 seconds, get those questions in. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. We're moving right along. Knight f6. This is the second most popular move, and honestly, a really nice try. Let's see. Let me keep up in my notes here. All right, so after knight f6, what do you guys think white's move is here? I don't think it should be too crazy. Fedi Yassin is saying play d3 if they play d5. We already covered that. They take on e4 and you lose your right to castle. But okay, if you guessed d4, you got it right. I mean, this is white's plan all along. Play d4 when it's safe. So this just keeps in line with c3. If you get your lines mixed up and you play queen a4, you're still going to be fine here, just black is able to play d6, and now you no longer have stuff like knight e5 to put pressure on c6. So something like bishop b5 might be the way you continue, but bishop d7, and it's all because this e5 pawn is protected. You're not going to have those tactics as before. So d4, and now they take on e4. They can also take this pawn on d4, and this capture here, taking on d4, is another possible transposition into the Goring Gambit. And it's a bit more double-edged than the main line we're going to be looking at. But white is going to play e5, and after knight to d5, c takes, bishop to b4, and you block with the bishop. And after the trade, you come out fine. White does have space. Black has a bit better development with their knights. They can also play knight e4 instead of knight d5, and this only changes slightly that if the knight can also control d2, you want to block with the knight. You don't want to play bishop d2 and have them trade the knight for the bishop. This would not be a favorable exchange, as your knight results in a pin. and knights are a little bit weaker than bishops, or bishops are slightly stronger in general. So e takes d4 is possible, but the main line we're going to be looking at is knight takes e4, and the general rule for the Ponziani is that whichever pawn they capture, you push the other. And this is to disrupt black's development. So here after pawn d5, this knight must move, and when this knight moves, it's going to give up control of e5. So where does black move? That's the new question. Well, one can argue that black doesn't need to move the knight at all and can play bishop to c5. The direct idea is that there is this double threat on f2. So if white takes on c3, it makes sense that black would capture on f2 with the bishop for the check and forces the king to e2. Now, the bishop goes back to b6, and the idea is you're clearing the square for the knight to go to f2. And now here, the only move for white is queen to d5. A very awkward looking move, but you are forking black's position here. And then knight to f2 attacking the rook. Here you can save the rook, and after castle's short, take on b7. Black captures, and now you have to capture on b7, otherwise your position's going to fall apart. But you take on b7, and the idea of giving up this piece is so they can go queen f6. And this position can be very scary for white if you don't know what you're doing. Here we get knight to a3. This is really the only way to develop this knight anymore. You can also go to d2, but you do block your bishop. And here, with you being so far behind in development, I don't really recommend it. You just go knight a3, leave this diagonal open for your bishop. You get pawn to e4, attacking the knight, and you get knight to c4. You can't go knight to d4 because knight g4 is going to be a huge threat. Just queen to f2. So you have to leave the knight here. You play knight c4, and rook to b8 is possible to play first. Again, if white ever moves the knight, well, okay, first you lose the queen, but again, knight g4 is also winning here. So you have to leave the knight on f3, rook a to b8, queen d5 is the only real safe square. If they go to a6, then takes on f3. If you take with the pawn, then rook to e8. So queen to d5, takes on f3, g takes, and now rook f to e8. The position's slightly different. You do have king to d2. And after knight to e4 check, this is trying to open up the position so that after you take, bishop takes g1. And this is kind of the point of moving the knight. You get the rook in the end. Bishop to d3, holding on to e4, and now we get really any move by black here. Sorry, not any move, but like c6 or queen f2. But probably queen f2 is what you'll see, black being very aggressive. You just have to go king d1. You can't block with the bishop, because when you block just queen to g2, they're adding more pressure to your position. And it's really hard to save this pawn now. So queen f2 is probably a good move there. So bishop c5, sacrificing a piece. If you see your opponent play this, this is a real line. They are not just giving up the knight on c6 for nothing. Another move that this knight on c6 can, I guess black can play, is this knight on c6 to b8 and just retreat the knight. And here you can take on e5. This was the point of playing pawn to d5. And now queen e7 attacking the knight. So here you get queen to d4 protecting, and pawn to d6 attacking the knight yet again. You have a couple options here, but I'm going to recommend just bishop to b5 check. They block with the bishop. When they block with the bishop, you can capture with your own. When they take back with knight, now you trade knights. Knight f6 is a very kind of creative move, just making sure white can lose their right to castle with bishop e3, just remedies this. But then you take on d7 with the queen here. You can't do that before because this knight on e4 will hang. And here, white has been known to be slightly better. Instead of knight to b8, the main move here is knight to e7 with the point that you are putting pressure on d5. And here we get knight takes e5. Again, the entire point of playing pawn d5 so you can recapture the pawn on e5. And here, the most played move in this position is actually a really bad move. The most played move here is d6, but this is a trap. After d6, which looks very logical, you want to kick the knight out of your position, white already has a 1 game. Bishop to b5 check. And the point is that black is going to lose a queen. If they block with the bishop, you take with your own bishop, the king is smothered, so you have to take with the queen. And now white is up a queen. No further analysis needed there. If you try blocking with the pawn, you capture on c6 with your own pawn. If they capture back, now you run into knight takes c6. And if they take on c6 with the knight, you capture with the bishop. And now after bishop d7, you don't go for this rook on a8. You actually go for the knight on e4. It's better to win a piece than to win an exchange. And here, they can try queen to e7, winning the bishop back, but you just castle. And if they try to get the bishop, they run into rook e1, and they're losing the queen here as well. So the main move, pawn to d6, just not good for black at all. I also want to cover knight to f7 because we did get this recommendation last week when we covered this line. But after king takes f7, white really has no follow-up. If you try queen f3, they just block with the knight on f6, and white is down a clean piece. So just wanted to make sure we mentioned that as well. But okay, after knight takes e5, what should black play? They can't play d6 because it fails to the bishop check. The safest way for them to continue is knight to g6, offering a trade of knights. And if they do trade, black is going to be happy. They just take with the h-pawn, take with the h-pawn, and now your rook is on an open file without developing. Your knight is okay to jump back. But okay, let's say white tries queen e2, which is the main move, trying to pin the knight. Here, queen e7 is forced. You can't go f5 because of f3. So you run into queen e7, and now bishop to f4 just develops. You're hitting this pawn on c7. You get pawn to d6, protecting this pawn on c7. And knight to a3, you're going to bring your knight into the center and develop this way. And one of the moves here that black has that has been played is also rook h5. But after like rook h5, castling queenside, rook f5, hitting the bishop, just bishop g3. Actually, sorry, not bishop g3. I have my notes mixed around. Bishop g3 is the wrong move to play. Very natural, but fails to knight f2. If you end up taking on f2, queen e2, bishop e2, and rook f2. So rather than bishop g3, which is the natural move, you want to play queen e3, protecting the bishop. So my apologies. You should play queen e3 here. And I guess how does black continue? You don't want to go bishop d7 because g4 will kind of trap the rook. Not bishop g5 here. Probably just bishop g2 instead is the continuation. So you'll probably see knight to f6, offering a trade of queens. This might be a way to continue for black. g5, Alatrevi, if you're putting g5, I ask that you mention where. It's hard to analyze if you just give a move. It is a legal move, but I don't know what the point is. Yes, g5 by black, because black's the only one who can play it, but where? After what move? g5 here? g5 here, now you can go bishop g3. This is fine. I don't see the point. You put a lot of question marks, like g5 was some stellar move. What do you do after this? This does not work out the same way. After knight to f2, bishop f2. Tactics, my friend. The queen is now protected by the bishop, so there's no queen trade. And if you take on f2, you take on f2 with the queen. You're losing a piece here. The difference is where the queen is and if black can get a queen trade. It's all good. But okay. We'll go back. That's if white ends up taking the knight. You don't need to take the knight here. You can just play queen takes d4. So queen, or sorry, not takes, just queen to d4, protecting the knight. This was kind of the same idea we had with one of the other variations where the knight was hanging by the queen. So queen f6, putting more pressure on the knight, and the trade-off here is that white is going to get this knight on e4 and give up the knight on e5. And now we might see a queen trade. And after this queen trade, I think that white's doing fairly well. They do have space, and it's hard to see how black is going to take advantage of this right away. And white can continue developing with tempo, mainly with bishop f4 hitting the knight. Now, if the knight goes back to g6, you hang this pawn on c7, and white has a winning endgame. So you have to play d6. And once you play d6, your bishop is no longer controlling a3, so white goes knight to a3, and will develop the knight through c2 and most likely on d4. We get bishop to e7, knight to c4 is also possible. The idea is that if knight takes, you take with the bishop, and all your pieces are developed, you're going to castle next move. Or, again, you have moves like knight to c2 if you want to develop the knight to the center. But here at this point, I think I can safely say we are out of the opening and in the endgame. Some people are probably going to say it's just a middle game, but quasi-endgame. And this is where I'm going to leave off the analysis. Here in this position, I think is almost completely equal for both sides. But someone's saying knight b5 in this position, and they're saying it's better. How exactly is it better after king d8? So king d8, I just protect. With the queens off the board, it's actually not so important if black can castle or not. At least here with development for both sides. In previous lines where you were losing the queens and the right to castle, that was different because you didn't have development. But here both sides do, and I don't see how much better white is because they went knight b5. I guess now you get knight d4. I guess this can be considered better because it's a more forcing way to develop the knight, but other than that, I don't see the point. I mean, this does allow rook e8 right away. But isn't interesting. The rook will have a long time to develop. I just developed the rook. And the rook on the queen side, the time for the rook on the queen side to develop doesn't change. But I think this is still it's a fine move to play. But I wouldn't say this is any margin better. But alright, we're going to open up the last 10 minutes here for questions. No need to apologize in the chat. They're definitely interesting ideas. But yeah, if you have any questions on any of the lines, if you thought of something after we moved on, now's your time to go back and ask your questions. In this position, white may be better. It's kind of scary from black's point of view. It might be scary from black's point of view because white does have the space. What if bishop d6 instead of pawn d6? Good question. So bishop d6, and the point is that I guess you're still defending the knight. You're getting ready to castle. I guess the main problem here is knight f3. Knight f3 is a threat. We're at bishop f4 and blocking with the bishop on d6, or sorry,
Hold on
defending.
1 second. I need to get the board back.
Ben needs to get the board back.
Yeah. Our board is missing. Okay, I'm just gonna go to a full screen board and then fix it when we're on. We're back.
We're back. So I hear.
Yes.
Okay. Bishop f4, blocking with the bishop, or defending the knight. And the threat is that if white does nothing, like a4, knight f3, and white is going to kind of be forced to ruin the pawn structure and lose a bishop, or their king is going to be kind of exposed. I guess their pawn structure is getting ruined anyway, right? So you can't, obviously don't play a4, but the remedy to this is knight to d2. That way if knight goes to f3, you take on f3, you still lose your bishop pair, but you're left with your good bishop on the light squares, with these pawns on the dark squares, and your knight's developed. So that's kind of what will happen if you play bishop d6. Maybe you might prefer this as black. I think I like it more when you have more pieces on the board because you can generate more chances that way. But hopefully that will answer your question. And I wish I could pronounce your name, but it looks like it's written in Russian. So, Mr. Russian person or Mrs. Russian person. There you go. That's what happens if you play bishop d6. All right. Do we have any other questions about the Ponziani? You're welcome, you're welcome. Let's see, I guess I'll give our brief summary here. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, pawn c3. This is the Ponziani opening. And the three main variations are f5, the Ponziani counter-gambit, where white can play d4 or takes, but d4 is more popular. And black has to play queen f6, otherwise white is going to get a bit of a lead. And you play knight g4, the strange-looking move, and bring the knight back to e3. If you're not playing the Ponziani counter-gambit, there's d5, where white plays queen a4. If you can create a pin here, you do it, and then this works because the knight can capture on e5 and add more pressure. And f6 is probably the best response. Strange looking, makes Ben Feingold have a heart attack before bed every night, but here we go. f6, you increase the pressure on the pin and develop as such. And then there is knight to f6, which is where you go pawn to d4 right away. Knight takes e4 and pawn d5. You capture the pawn on e5 to get your pawn back, and then trade off knights in the center, and you will result in this type of endgame. All right. If black is greedy, taking on e4 with the knight. Let me see. I'm just double checking here. Here after knight f6, and they take right away. This is our main line. Yeah, so we've already covered this. But all right, if there are no more questions, we will wrap up the lecture here, and we are going to move into the second to last of our series, The Winner's Circle, where we're going to be covering the last few rounds of Vasily Smyslov's 1953 Zurich candidates run. So I'll hope to see you there.